Well, welcome to the Non-Obvious Beyond Diversity Summit. I am your host, Pamela Slim, and I am a business coach, an author, and a co-founder with my husband, Daryl, of the Main Street Learning Lab right behind me here in the Mesa, Arizona area. It's my honor to be speaking today and moderating a panel with Isha Cogborn, Augie Gastelum, and Debbie Nez Manuel. This is going to be an eye-opening panel, which we're calling, and I'm going to read my notes to make sure I get it precisely, Building Equitable, Inclusive, and Diverse Economic Engines in Your Neighborhood. We really want to thank the organizers of this summit. And if you are one who likes to tweet or Facebook or TikTok along, or your social media of choice, the hashtag is nonobviousdiversity. I wanted to get started by having each of our presenters introduce themselves, and per things that we've learned together in connection. We all do work together here in Mesa. We all have professional relationships, and I will also say we have beloved personal relationships. Everybody on this panel is somebody who I hold very near and dear to me. And one of the ways that I love in introductions is to, talk about who you are, the main kind of focus of the work for the context of this panel, and also how it is that you identify yourself from a cultural perspective. So Isha, I will start with you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Isha Cogborn, and I'm the founder of Startup Life Support. And we started that initiative 4 years ago. It's a membership-based community that our members like to call AA for Entrepreneurs. And the focus of it is really helping people as they go through that journey of starting and growing a business, because we know that there are a lot of challenges that the people in our lives who maybe love us most just don't get. And I identify as Black, African American, if you prefer, Blackity Black, if you prefer. And Pam, thanks for having me here today.
Thank you, Isha. Augie, I'm going to turn to you.
Oh, thank you, Pam. My name is Augie Gastelum. I am the founder of Patchwork Community Inclusion, and Patchwork Community Inclusion is a community and economic development consulting firm located here in Mesa, Arizona. Really, our work is focused on bringing equity and inclusion into both community development and economic development activities in our area. And we do a lot of work with small businesses of color along the light rail corridor, along a commercial corridor, and also with communities of color in the neighborhoods adjacent to those commercial corridors. I identify as Mexican. I am a native of Mexico, and I am excited to be here and have this conversation.
Great, thank you so much. And Debbie.
Good morning. It's so good to be here with you this morning. Here in the desert, we just had rain, and it's really invigorating. I am a citizen of the Navajo Nation, and I also am an elected member of the DNC, which is a Democratic National Committee, and I'm really happy to be here. In this community, I wear so many different hats. I'm a nonprofit organizer. I worked with our party. I work closely with our grassroots organizations, and especially love our young people, our youth, our Indigenous youth, and our elders, those who have done so much and contributed to all of the rewards that we enjoy each and every day. Glad to be here with everyone.
It is so wonderful to have you, Debbie. Thank you. And I just, for myself, in my own identity, I'm a 54, almost 55-year-old white woman. And in the context of economic development, knowing the work that we do, in particular, the kind of impact that our identities have, I'm really excited to have the panel of leaders that we have here today. And so, Debbie, to start, I'm really happy that the Non-Obvious Beyond Diversity Summit has been encouraging panels to do a land acknowledgement. So I'm going to ask you if you would do that for us today.
Sure. For those who are maybe not familiar with the land acknowledgement, it's just, taking it back. It's taking a moment to acknowledge the indigenous lands that you are on today, wherever you might be, anywhere in this country. And it's important to look ahead and realize that with all of the 300, years of policy that's been going on, we really need to acknowledge the successes that have been built upon. So today I'm in Maricopa County in Arizona, and we are in the mid area of the state. So when you look at these lands here, the land base here, they are rooted in the spirit and the legacy of those elders who once were here. They have built this very complex canal system that many of the municipalities are built on today. Some of those tribes represent many different, and depending on how far we go back into our history, that could mean a lot of different things. So we know that the Accomer, who are representatives of the Gila River Indian community and the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community, this was their home. And we also acknowledge in modern day the Pipash who are living here among the people, and the people of the Guadalupe. And so many stories exist within that space. So many people have stories that we either have heard in very open public spaces, and some that are just rooted within our philosophy of, in families. And so taking this time, no matter where you're at, is really important, acknowledging those indigenous roots that, we thrive in today. So thank you so much for taking this time. We are happy to talk more about that if you would like to learn more. Thank you, Pam.
Thank you, Debbie, so much. Yeah. So I'd love to give a little bit of context as we dive into work today, because there's a really specific reason why it is that I chose the three of you. We're here in Mesa, Arizona, which is just about 20 minutes from the airport in Phoenix, for those of you who have come in the area. And in particular, there's a downtown area on Main Street, which is right behind me here, where our learning lab is right on Main Street, which is a wonderful place that's surrounded by diverse neighborhoods, as Augie was talking about, from folks that come from different backgrounds, different economic perspectives. And there's a lot of work that's currently happening here. That's kind of coming from many different directions. So there's been an influx of lots and lots of money on Main Street in terms of building residences, of building businesses. We have a brand new project with Arizona State University that's building a large building just a couple blocks down from here, which will be a whole new facility in the area, as well as a lot of events normally that are happening within our arts community and then within our extended neighborhoods. And so for each of the panelists here today, they've really taken a very proactive step to actively participate, to speak up, to begin to figure out what projects are going on, and to begin to now, especially more with kind of some of the organized projects, participate in some of the active community engagement. But a lot of times when we look at participation, it really is where somebody is called in order to help and support. And in each of your cases, you have said, this is work that needs to be done, and so I'm going to show up and do it. So that's kind of the first conversation point I'd love to talk about, which is one of the things in the work we've done together that we've seen as a trend, is that a lot of economic development efforts, kind of local efforts to be creating more inclusive economic environments in downtowns, is really backwards. And it's done where it's generally organized by the dominant population, which here in Mesa tends to be more white folks like me. And then there can be an invitation for folks of color or folks that come from different marginalized identities to come in and share perspective. What is your thought, starting Isha, from your perspective, about what's flawed about that strategy?
Well, one of the challenges with that strategy is that it can create frustration on both sides. So if the strategy is already fully formed and then you're inviting diverse voices to the table, and there are obvious blind spots to, say, me coming to the table and, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Well, you've already laid the plans out. And so now I'm coming to the table and asking all these questions, although you may be glad to have my voice there. Now I have now made you start from scratch or have to undo all of the hard work that's already been done. So while you may value my presence, you're frustrated by it too. And it can also cause that person, that diverse voice that's been invited in, if you see that your opinions or your thoughts or the questions that you're raising aren't being carefully considered, or nothing's going to come out of you raising those actions, you may not want your name associated with it. Because when this thing rolls out and there are issues associated, and they say, well, Isha was a part of the committee, so surely she brought your voice to the table. And the voice may have been there, but if it wasn't brought in at a point where it could be acted upon, then that may cause me to say, well, you know what? I don't want to be a part of this. I'm gone. And then that could go on to say, well, we tried, but it didn't work out, or they didn't want to play nice. So, we won't do it that way next time.
Absolutely. Augie, how about you?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you just hit it like spot on. And sometimes one of the things that I can't figure out if this is by design or if it is by accident. And sometimes I feel one way and sometimes I feel another. But the end result, regardless of whether it's by design or by accident, the end result is that nobody's happy, right? I do not feel heard because I was brought into the conversation once the decisions were made, and you, the person who organized this, feel upset and sort of that I'm being aggressive because of the questions or the things that I'm bringing up, because it's a different perspective than the one that you came in with. And so nobody wins. Everybody walks away with a sort of a negative, a bad taste in their mouth, and ultimately creates a difficult situation within the community. And I would love to believe that it is not done on purpose, and that it is just a matter of learning to do it differently. But it is so prominent, and it is such an ongoing thing that, like, wouldn't you have learned by now? And to that point, I think there are things that are starting to happen that way, that are starting to happen in a more inclusive way. I mean, my company is Patchwork Community Inclusion, and the whole purpose of it is to include the community in conversations really before the conversations start happening, and or before decisions start to be made, and we're starting to see little bits of that, but it is still so, at least from my perspective, so far behind where we should be that, like, we need to hit the fast forward button, and we just like need to skip a few of these situations to get to a better result. At the end of the day, Isha, what you explained, or the way of doing things, as opposed to the way that things are done, are so much more productive. It is so much more productive for everyone involved when you start the conversation from the beginning. And most of the time you're going to end up at a slightly different place, and maybe that's a part of the problem, right? That things end up at a slightly different place where the planners are wanting things to end up. But at the end of the day, it's been my experience that it is always better for the community when it's done that way.
I love that. Debbie, knowing my husband is Diné Navajo, like Debbie. And so one of the things I've noticed in particular is, of all the folks who might be, even added late in the process that often Native American community members, leaders are often, especially left out. What's your experience been with the process, and what's the result that you've seen with not involving voices from the community and leadership?
One of the most vivid responses I could, state to that is something that that we've heard on this panel today, is that you become the disruptor, you become the irate voice, the protester in the room, and man, do you get frowned upon for that? It's happened to me time and time again, and I'm sure. As you know, Pam, in our Navajo society, we earn our name, right? We earn our name even as an in-law. When we approach our residence, somebody's already calling us by name, and the minute we leave the door, we have earned our name because of something or someone we've become. I've become that person in these political spaces, talking about policy, and I actually had a person of color which knocked me to the floor. I mean, not personally, not throwing me down, but their words were so powerful. And they're like, we could get more work done, Debbie, if you would just stay focused and focus on solutions. And I'm like, whoa, that kind of throws you when hearing it for the first time. But, in this panel, I know that I'm right. I know I'm doing right by others, by stating the obvious, and we need to have these things. We need to have these spaces and these conversations. I like the fact that we can focus on some of these systems that was mentioned also about, is this intentional? It is intentional. It's intentional to keep people of color out of those spaces, even women out of those spaces, people with voices who are speaking about very specific things like disabilities. Those are very serious things. One case, an example is, as a candidate, when I ran this past couple of times, when I'm searching for funding to support my vision, every source asks me for data. We want to see your data. Are you a viable candidate? Are you for real? Is basically what they're asking me. But when I look at our political party systems, very little is run on data. I'm expected as a person of color to bring my data and to bring it forward, and I better be ready. I better be concise. But when we lean back on those institutions and ask them the same thing, there's crickets. So as a person of color, as an Indigenous woman, I'm very unapologetic. I hold them accountable. I will protest. I will bring and question many things about the system. So I do believe it's intentional. Until data is present, available, and accessible for everyone, it's intentional. Thank you.
I so appreciate that. And, so there's a couple things that are really striking to me about it. One, knowing in the spirit of this summit, we're wanting to be very actionable, with recommendations. And so a first one that's very clear and strong that I hear is just involve folks much earlier before a design is done. It's not, let's just put together kind of the straw design and then let's get input, because there are so many foundational things that by virtue of sometimes just being, within your own bubble of your lived experience, you may not take certain things into consideration. And so in that case, when there is involvement earlier, it can make such a big difference. The other thing that was really striking to me is hearing each of you describe how that later involvement can put you personally in a role that is somebody who's an adversary, that it's very powerful to hear it that way, where as opposed to somebody who is helping to strengthen the success of a project, somebody who wants to see it succeed, that can be looked at as somebody who is an adversary. So I really appreciate that insight for that first part of the project. So in that spirit, really looking at getting the work done, knowing that systemically in a design process, and this is everything from one project I know that Augie and I happen to be working on with the ASU project, right, of really earlier on involving people. It can also be for events that you might have where you really are excited to be welcoming, more diverse members of the community. Things need to be done earlier. But how do you do that? There's a process that my husband Daryl and I used when we opened this space, which was spending a lot of time with what we ended up calling listen first, and just spending time listening to people, not saying, here are our programs, do you want to attend? But just sitting down and listening and having people kind of, talk about themselves and what their goals and their visions were. From each of your perspective, and in this case, you can just pop in for any of you that want to take it up first. But what does it really look like? What does that look like from your perspective when it's done right? When you are engaged earlier, how does that engagement actually begin? And from the beginning, like what would be a good first outreach, and then how might that look?
I think for me, what I really appreciate is when there's silence. When we enjoy that silence, we ask a question and we savor that silence and listen, actively listen. I know for me, from a very young age, I've been taught to respect. If our elders are teaching us how to care for the animals, or how to build a fire, or how to carry yourself in ceremony, you're constantly observing and watching, and you're going to see what happens. And then if something out of the ordinary happens, you're watching how everyone around you reacts. So you're listening constantly. And I think that's a philosophy that I've been raised with. And I think many people of color or cultures have been raised with that. But the contradiction or the conflict that happens is in the Western framework. We constantly have to be talking. We constantly have to be saying something all the time, to the point where all we're doing is talking and listening to ourselves. We're not hearing other people around us. And I think that this journey that I take when someone asks a question, because I've been raised in kinship, because I've been raised to respect, age groups and the generations before me, the generations, that aren't even here yet. I'm constantly looking in those spaces thinking, well, that person has asked me something. I'm absorbing all of it. I'm thinking in everything from our values to the lifestyles we have, to the possibilities, the opportunities that are there. And that silence is helping me to form that solution. But in Western concept, it's like, oh, they're not going to contribute anything. They can't handle the silence. It drives them crazy. And we really need to think about that. I think as we go forward, I always want to remind people that silence has an opportunity for several solutions to form. And, let's enjoy that for a little bit, before we jump right in and ask the second, third, or fourth question, or wrap up a meeting within a very timely manner. So that's something that comes to mind right away.
I love that.
I love that, Debbie. That's a concept and an idea that I can learn from and follow it and gain something really positive out of. And I think along with that, there's a I had a mentor that would say this term all the time, and he would always say, begin with the end in mind. And as a concept, that's good. It's important to kind of know where you're headed. But I think often when we get into situations of planning, whether it's for something with the community, with businesses, whether it's a city that is planning something, they already have the end in mind, and that becomes the problem. I think in every situation when we're working with community, especially with communities of color, with cultures that are different from the dominant culture in our area, being flexible to change and adapt to what is being brought up is really a critical piece that should be a part of any planning process, because the community is going to bring different perspectives that change the direction of where things are going. And if you don't go into that with the idea and understanding that you can adapt and that end that you had in mind might be different, then you're wasting everybody's time. You're wasting your time, you're wasting the community's time. And the more we do that, the more we waste the community's time, the less they want to participate. And again, that goes back to, is this by design? Because the more you waste the community's time, the less the community wants to be involved and engaged. And then it just becomes that, well, they don't want to participate. And so that idea of begin with the end in mind needs to be kind of turned on its head, and really begin knowing that things may end at a different place.
Oh, I love that.
I love that, Augie.
Mhm.
Yeah, the silence. It's so funny, because that's one of the things in my coaching communities. When it gets real quiet, I'm not afraid of silence. We can sit here all day. I'm good. Like, you don't have to feel like you got to jump in and talk just to fill the space. But one of the things that I think is a challenge too is we bring human nature often in these conversations where our intention is to listen and to hear thoughts or opinions that may be in conflict with what we believe or what we have held as true. Mm-hmm. And when those thoughts or opinions are in conflict, what do we do when we are put in a position of conflict? We fight back, or we reject, or we stop listening. That's one of the challenges that we have in our country today, is because we're not willing to accept that a thought or an opinion that is in direct contrast with our thoughts or opinions can still be true. And I think we all need to challenge ourselves to be willing to ask those follow-up questions. Well, tell me more about your experiences that have led you to feel this way, or to believe that this is the right approach. And the more that we can truly seek to understand what has shaped that person's thoughts and opinions, we can operate from a more common space. But if it's just, well, I don't believe that that's true, that doesn't happen. Well, it doesn't happen in your world, but it doesn't mean it doesn't happen for others. And so we've got to be willing to open ourselves up to things that we may have, that again, may be in direct conflict with what we believe.
Yeah, so many wonderful gems in each of your answers, of thinking, first of all, it can be so uncomfortable for folks to be in silence and to be listening. Mm-hmm. I know when we were here for a long time having a physical space, and people would say, well, what is this place? And I'd be like, I don't know, we're kind of waiting to see what she wants, and like what the community wants. And I noticed within my own, like, Anglo business culture, right, kind of dominant culture mind, there were things where I was questioning my own self, like, are we really doing the right thing? Like, shouldn't I just decide, this is an incubator space, or this is a training facility? But really in conversation with many of you, and just noticing a difference that it makes to first develop in relationship, to form that connection, to listen, is so important, and to get comfortable. It is the space, Isha and I both being business coaches, that where real learning comes through, where breakthroughs come, because we're forced really to sit sometimes with that discomfort. And then I love, Augie, that beginning with with an open-ended idea about what's going to happen. And by design, really knowing as you have goals of a project, it definitely, a lot of what we're doing here is creating an innovation district that's really driven by innovation and creativity. And how much more of a route is that, right? Like, we are curious to see through our engagement what will emerge, and we're going to be comfortable with not knowing exactly what's going to be, which, as you said, can open up the space for people, really to be doing that. And then Isha, from your perspective, it's so powerful as well to really just think about how in doing that work, you end up having such a different kind of relationship, with people. Like, there's so much ease, there's so much connection that happens. And I think, again, kind of by design, you can really be creating things that are truly unique. One of the things I know for me that was so powerful, that speaks to what you're talking about, Isha, and this is in my, as a white person, identity, believe people. when they say what their experience is. There are many times I am shocked, appalled, and nauseated when somebody might open up in a context and say, I had a very uncomfortable experience when I went into a space, and I could feel like there was some active racism or discrimination happening. And I've seen a lot of my own folks many times just say, oh, Isha, you must have just been overthinking it. I know that person. They're not like that. And that to me is the most gaslighting kind of behavior. So I love that advice to really dig deeper and say, tell me more about that. What was that like? And just to know from in my own identity, like there are things I cannot have the same lived experience as you have because of the way that the world reacts to you. So believing you first, listen first, and believe first, as opposed to refuting, as opposed to saying, no, it's really not like that, which I would imagine would kind of cut things off. That's really powerful. Well, as we're kind of winding into the last part of our panel today, I'd like really for each of you just to be thinking about in ways that are relevant. I know that people who may be tuning in today are everything from, a business owner who might have a brick and mortar who is interested in having more diverse customers, partners. There could be people that work in cities and local government that truly are excited about, creating more representation. As I always say, for me, diversity and inclusion is actually just having the people who live in the community represented in participation and leadership, is one thing. But what's maybe just a really germane lesson, something that you've learned in doing the work that you think would be really important for people to know when they're trying to create these difficult, collective, right, kind of bigger projects where we have people who often have different interests working together? What are each of you, what's a key lesson that you would like to share around that topic? Isha, I think I'll start with you.
Ooh, a lot of things are spiraling through my head right now. One of the places I think there is to start is to just recognize when we're talking about diversity, when we're talking about having voices at the table, when we're talking about representation, that there isn't having one voice at the table doesn't mean that you have covered the gamut of perspectives or ideas. I don't speak for all Black people. And if you talk to 5 different people, you may get 5 different experiences or backgrounds or ways of doing things. And so, and I see this a lot. So if we take this from the standpoint of trying to attract customers, you see sometimes these very obvious ways of, let's just call it pandering. This is what it is when you're trying to speak to a specific, perhaps ethnic group. And it's, okay, well, we'll put a hip hop beat under that, or we'll throw our Black Lives Matter sign in the window and that'll attract the Black customers, or, whatever these things are. But that's not going to get it. That's not going to do it. And so really understanding the diversity of experiences and backgrounds and thought processes, somebody that, I grew up in most of the experiences in my life where I was always one of very few Black people. And so I have a different way of navigating through the world based on that, and perhaps a different comfort level than my best friend who grew up in Detroit in a, predominantly, especially at that time, a city that was probably 98% Black, who went to a high school that was probably 99% Black. And then when we got to our university that was 4% minority, she had a very different experience than I did. And so thinking that just there's one way of reaching people or one way of relating to people is a very flawed way of approaching things to begin with. So understanding that diversity between even groups and knowing that you have to do the work to understand that.
Yeah. Is there any just a tip in terms of how you might do that? Is it folks reading or researching or attending functions? Any recommendations that way for people who want to get a broader understanding of particular communities?
all of the above. So here's one of the things that we heard a lot in the summer. I definitely had a lot of people that were wanting to ask me questions, and sometimes it does get tiring, and it's like, well, educate yourself. So yeah, educate yourself, read, watch movies, do things, but then have the conversations as well. Intentionally expand your professional and your personal circles beyond having the one representative there that you can check that box and say, oh, I have one Black customer, I have one Black friend, I have one, Latino contractor, and so I've covered it. But really looking to because the world that I move around in, I know a lot of white people, and I know that you are not all the same. And I'm not going to make that assumption. And so the same way that I have that level of exposure, you may have to be very intentional on giving yourself that level of exposure.
I appreciate that. Augie?
Yeah. So I think it is important to know and understand that inclusion can feel messy and difficult and uncomfortable. Because you're bringing in different perspectives, and there's nothing wrong with all of those feelings. I think often those feelings are viewed as negatives, when in reality they ultimately will get to a positive result. And so it's harder. Doing things in an inclusive manner might feel harder at first, but just don't let that be the reason why you don't. Don't let that be the reason why you don't develop an inclusive process. And on the other side, for whether it's a community member that is participating in processes, if you are the one that's feeling uncomfortable because you're the one that's bringing the different perspective, so be it. It's important. That perspective is important. I grew up here in Mesa, and when I was a kid, Mesa was a very, very predominant white and a very monolithic culture, I'll say. And really most of my friends growing up in junior high school, elementary school were white. And most of my professional involvement and community involvement in the early stages, I was literally the only brown person in the room. And for a long time, I just kind of went along with it because it was uncomfortable, and I didn't want the things that just didn't make sense as decisions were being made. I just kind of sat back and let those decisions being made because I felt uncomfortable. And it wasn't until I started asking questions, and it was just questions. It wasn't pushing for anything. When I started asking questions, and then I began to get pushback and realized that this is why I'm here. This is why I am in this room, to ask these questions, to bring in this perspective. It wasn't until then that I really felt like what I was doing was contributing. And in some cases, it literally pushed me out of the room. I was forced out of rooms, out of conversations, but that it made me stronger. It developed a perspective that was different than what I had before. And so for those who are looking to be involved and feel uncomfortable, continue feeling uncomfortable until and pushing until you feel better, because that will drive a better conversation. And for those who are doing the planning, just know and understand that it probably will be uncomfortable, and there's nothing wrong with that.
I so appreciate that. And Debbie, in kind of our final wrap-up point today, what about from your perspective? What would you just love that everybody doing this work knows?
I think that when I process that question, that's a really heavy question, is to recognize that, my voice is one of the most valuable parts of this conversation. My voice comes from that as a mother, as a sister, as an Indigenous woman. And this change begins with me. And the reason why it's so important that it begin with me is because nobody else knows how to incorporate my voice. So I find myself constantly teaching people, how do you do this? This is how you do this is one way you can do it. This is another way you can do it. And then let's practice that. Let's see if it works. But there's this idea, this general understanding that we're all the same. When in fact we're not. I like what Isha was saying, is the fact that she doesn't speak for all Black women. I don't speak for all Indigenous people at all. And I try really hard to remember that, because in Arizona here, we have regional areas. We have the urban area, which often are big decision makers for a lot of places. They determine policy for our children, for the men and the women, and for our veterans, and for our healthcare and our education. But we also have people in rural and remote and even isolated places in Arizona. And while most of us will gravitate to these urban places to become part of these decision makers or influencers, does that mean the people in those rural, remote, and isolated places have less of a voice? They're choosing that lifestyle just as most will choose an urban lifestyle, a place where there's a lot of resources. But we have to be really mindful that change begins with us. And as hard as it is to unravel those 300 years of policy and the way we do things, we have to unlearn a lot of stuff. And so we really have to begin to look at ourselves and then teach others how to do that. And so it's really important to be thoughtful in that process as we begin to grow.
I so appreciate that kind of personal perspective. It reminds me, Augie, of a story that you told me. I'll never forget the conversation when we were here. Augie is one of the first people I met, who's just been working down here for years and years, personally and professionally as a resident of downtown. But I remember we were talking about sometimes that frustration about the pace of progress, the context you're talking about, Debbie, of like 300, years of policy, of belief systems, of structures that are supporting a certain way. And I remember, in talking with Augie and, about the vision of what it would mean to be creating a really inclusive place where not only that people had access to the resources that were here, not only were there people in positions of leadership, not only are there economic benefits to having business leaders who are here that come from the diverse communities, but that it's a place where people would choose to be, that they'd be excited to come downtown and show off like the place that is theirs, their home. And I remember you, Augie, talking to me saying, look at the kind of systemic issues that we have within our community politically and culturally, and just some of the resistance. If we can figure out how to do it here, then we can do it anywhere. Yeah. And I will never, ever forget that. It was so meaningful. It brings tears to my eyes again, thinking about that. That's maybe that continuation as we kind of look at the timing of what we've talked about here today. We have starting way earlier to build relationships, to begin to engage, as Isha is saying, research, get to know people, challenge your assumptions, begin to involve people far earlier in the process of design. And then when doing the work, have that understanding of not coming in with a predetermined agenda, being excited and open to knowing that things can change and be shaped by a variety of people. And then just knowing, take your timeline for when you think things are going to change and multiply it by 200 years, knowing for, each of you, and again, knowing you personally as well as work together, the work that you're doing is legacy work. The work that you're doing is generational. You're doing it not just for yourselves, for your children, for your grandchildren, for your great-grandchildren. And that to me is the part where we can ease a little bit from that sort of, white supremacy culture, like everything is urgent. And if everything doesn't happen today, then it's not going to happen, because that to me is really what gives energy, for the journey. So I really appreciate each of you so much, your individual contributions, showing up and participating in the panel. I'm sure we'll make sure that people can connect with each of you individually at the Non-Obvious Diversity Summit. This has been, we're right here on time. So this has been Building Equitable, Inclusive, and Diverse Economic Engines in Your Neighborhood with myself, Pamela Slim, Isha Cogborn, Augie Gastelum, and Debbie Nez Manuel. There are so many other amazing topics within this summit that I know I'm excited to dig into. People from all genres, genders, and geographies. And just to be clear, this panel was really focused on the lived experience of the presenters. There's so many different dimensions of diversity and diverse perspectives that were not represented. So make sure that you dive into the other sessions. You can visit nonobviousdiversity.com for a full schedule to participate in all of the sessions. And so finally, I'm Pamela Slim, and always remember to stay non-obvious. Thanks, everyone.